ikaw ay nei ahwati to pagahai ay awi ay ba oi kapio e kubai so gagai hiaiche ikaw ay
Okay.
ikaw.
Okay.
Okay, so he said it's okay to use his image for other people to see it in other jungles.
Okay.
Ikaw.
Okay. Tika Pirah na. He go guys. Okay. No. He go guys. Awi. Ay ba hiaiche ay bas.
Ai awi aga oi kapio e higai sai kubai so gagai hiaiche ai sai ba se kubai sai ai dai ahwai so ike hai awi kapio
Okay.
Hello. Today I'm here to talk about the Pirahã language, which is spoken in the Amazon. And I don't normally do languages outside of the specific area that I know best, which is sort of Germanic linguistics. But I thought in this case it's an interesting topic because the Pirahã language is one that makes a lot of people interested in linguistics roll their eyes because there's a lot of controversy surrounding its syntax, which I'll touch on briefly at the end of the video. But ultimately they are just people speaking their own language, and it is an interesting language in its own right, no matter what you think of the controversy. So I thought to balance out the reams of materials that focus on the controversial aspects of Pirahã, I would just do a nice little video focusing on the phonology of Pirahã and how it's pronounced, just so that there's a nice little resource on something that's relatively uncontroversial. It has a few features which are typologically rare across the world's languages. So for one thing, Pirahã speakers only make use of 10 or 11 phonemes or speech sounds, and that's depending on how you analyse the sound system. So for reference, English has something like 35 or 45, depending on which dialect you speak. Pirahã's phonemes are divided into 3 vowels and either 7 or 8 consonants. There are plenty of languages that have vowel systems with only 3 vowels, so Arabic is a larger example, but most of the time, if a language only has 3 vowels, you can bet that there's something like I, U and A, or something like that, for reasons I'll explain in a later video. Pirahã's 3 vowel system is slightly non-standard in that way, because the basic vowel phonemes are I, O, A. And in practice, listening to recordings of Pirahã, these phonemes have really wide allophonic ranges, which means that they don't have to be pronounced strictly as I or A, but they can be pronounced a lot more laxly, like E, O, A, with the tongue a lot more central in the mouth. Because there are only 3 vowels and they're really spaced out within the vowel space, pronouncing a vowel slightly low or high or central doesn't really matter, because there are no other vowel phonemes anywhere near it to get it confused with. So when the man from the start of the video speaks, you can hear that the vowels are often really lax. He almost always pronounces this vowel phoneme as E, or something like that, rather than E. So that's the vowel system, which is fairly uncomplicated. The consonant system is a little bit more complicated. So as I said, Pirahã has between 7 and 8 consonants, depending on the speaker and also depending on how you analyse it. And when I say it has 7 or 8 consonants, I mean meaningfully distinct consonants, so consonant phonemes. And for a video on the difference between phones and phonemes, I've linked one in the description, and I'll hopefully be releasing a few more explanatory ones in the future. But it has 7 or 8 meaningfully distinct sounds that speakers recognise as separate sounds from each other. I've listed the basic consonant phonemes on screen, and most of these symbols are easily interpretable to an English speaker, except maybe this question mark thing, which represents a glottal stop. And a glottal stop is a consonant that's made by closing or suddenly opening the glottis, which is an opening in the vocal folds. And a lot of English speakers use the glottal stop as an allophone of the t phoneme. So this word can be pronounced cat, or this word can be butter, depending on your dialect. But in Pirahã, this glottal stop is a full phoneme, which means that it's a consonant in its own right, just as important as b, g, s, and so on. So the basic consonant phonemes are ba, da, ga, ba, ga, ha, sa, a. Notice that when I say the glottal stop, it may just sound like I'm just saying the vowel a with nothing in front of it. And that's because in English, a lot of words that start with vowels actually start with a glottal stop. Actually. The difference, no glottal stop, a, glottal stop, a. you hear how one starts more abruptly as I'm opening the glottis. Ah, ah. So these are the basic consonants. Some of these consonants have rules governing how you pronounce them in what environments, and that's true of consonants in most languages. So, for example, where you find the b phoneme at the start of a word, it's sometimes pronounced m. In English, b and m are two meaningfully different phonemes, but Pirahã speakers use them as versions of the same sound. M is just how you sometimes pronounce b after a pause in speech. Or to put it another way, you pronounce it as m at the start of a word unless that word is in the middle of flowing speech. And that makes a bit of sense, because m and b are quite similar sounds. They both are pronounced bilabially, so with both of the lips, and they're also both voiced, which means the vocal folds vibrate the whole time you're saying both of them. You can feel the buzzing if you put your fingers where your Adam's apple is or would be. M, b. There's a similar rule, meaning that the g phoneme is sometimes pronounced n after pauses in speech. And this is a little bit stranger because g and n have the tongue in different parts of the mouth. For n, it's at the alveolar ridge above the teeth, and for g, it's drawn back to the soft palate. But this kind of thing is definitely not unheard of across languages. The b phoneme has an extra strange allophone by English standards. If it comes before the o phoneme, it's sometimes pronounced as a bilabial trill. This isn't so much a rolled R as a rolled B. Bro, bro. Again, this sound exists in some other languages and it's not unique to Pirahã. If the s phoneme comes before E, it's pronounced as sh, which is, I think, the same as the sh of English, but it sounds like it's slightly drawn upwards so that the tip of the tongue is slightly higher up, maybe above the alveolar ridge. Sh, sh. Although all those kinds of sounds I'm not very good at differentiating, so I could be describing that slightly wrong. You can hear these phonemic features when you listen to speakers saying words in isolation. Here are some recordings from the UCLA Phonetics Lab archive. I'll run through a few speakers for each word, 2 men and 2 women. First of all, the word me, which means blood.
Me, 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 me.
In all these recordings, the speakers are saying the word on its own, in isolation, so it starts with this nasal sound, which is usually m, although in a couple of cases it sounds like the tongue is drawn up towards the velum, almost like m. The vowel is ear across all speakers, with the tip of the tongue fairly front and high in the mouth, but not all the way in that direction like e. It's still fairly central in the mouth like ear. Now, I imagine one of the difficulties with doing field research with a group like this is that it's quite difficult to explain what you want. Because, as English speakers, it's easy for us to tell where the boundaries between words are because we're taught to read and write from a young age. But if you're not taught to read and write or analyse your language in that way, it's not necessarily obvious where the breaks between words are. Speech is just a flowing thing. You do it almost automatically. It just, your thoughts translate to speech just like that, and you don't have to think about where one word ends and the next word starts. So if you're doing field research with people that don't read or write, asking them for a word in isolation, they might not quite give you what they want, so or rather what you want. So if you ask for the word blood, they might say, okay, blood, or the blood, or yeah, blood, or something like that. Because they're used to speech as a flowing thing, and they're not necessarily used to saying words in isolation or thinking about them as discrete things, it's not necessarily going to be easy to elicit individual words from them. And that seems to have happened a few times with these recordings. Just impressionistically, based on me listening to it, I might not be right here, but it sounds like the speakers who are younger have cottoned on better to what the researchers are trying to get out of them. And so those recordings are slightly more helpful in terms of having words on their own. But where speakers don't quite understand where word boundaries are, that's helpful for the purposes of this video because it means you can hear something important. When she's asked to say the word blood, me, the older woman says a couple of things followed by the word me.
Maybe.
In this instance, she doesn't say me, she says be. Fundamentally, it's the same word, but in this case, it's not after a pause in speech. It comes straight after the word I. The first phoneme is realised as b rather than m, because here it's in flowing speech, it's not after a pause. Instead of being I me, it's I be. This is a good illustration of that allophonic rule that I mentioned earlier. This phoneme is pronounced b unless it's after a pause, in which case it's m. The speaker treats them as versions of the same sound. Let's go through a few more words to get a feel for how the language sounds. Another interesting thing about the language pops up here. In the last two words, the younger of the two women pronounces h, where men pronounce s. The older woman varies between sh and h. This is something the Everetts observed. So for men, the s and h phonemes are usually kept separate from each other, but for at least some women, they're merged to just h. The Everetts suggest that some women don't have the s phoneme at all, and that it's collapsed into the h phoneme. So in other words, they use one less phoneme than other people in the group. This kind of difference between the speech of men and women isn't that rare cross-linguistically. Because a lot of cultures treat men and women as occupying different social categories, and they often pass through slightly different social institutions when they grow up, it's not that unusual for men and women to end up speaking slightly differently to each other even within the same culture, and for those differences to be maintained over time. I actually think that in my own dialect there are sound changes that women have more often than men, although that's a surface level phonetic thing, not a deeper phonemic thing. I think that women around me often pronounce the kit and dress vowels lower in the mouth than men do, so kit, dress. Maybe not quite that low, but lower than the average man does. So I might cover that in another video if I can find evidence for it. But in the Pirahã situation, it's not just to do with the way they pronounce sounds, it's to do with the underlying sound categories. For some women, the sound categories represented by s and h have blended together. It's not just that they're pronouncing s like sh and h like ch or something like that. The two sounds have completely merged into one. You might have noticed, or you might already know, that tone is phonemic in Pirahã. So each vowel takes either a high or a low tone, and that's phonemic, so it can make the differences between words. Let's think about how this works in vowels. We'll take a word that Everett uses as an example a lot. Magiai means friend, and magiai means enemy or thief. You could make up a further two words where the tone is on different vowels. Magiai, magiai. You could even have high tones on more than one vowel. Magiai, magiai. So out of this one string of phonemes, you could in theory get 6 or more words with completely different meanings. You can also double up vowels so they're pronounced twice as long, and in this case either one can take a high tone. Pirahã's reliance on tones allows for something quite interesting. So listen to one of the researchers trying to get certain words from the older woman. She's humming the words. And if it was just this recording in isolation, that could just be an older person a bit tired with the task they're doing. But this is apparently fairly common in Pirahã. People can just hum and whistle the tones of speech and understand each other perfectly well. This is a good time to bring in the idea of functional load. In linguistics, functional load refers to how much speakers rely on a particular feature to be able to understand each other. In Pirahã, tones have a very high functional load, which means they're really important for the speaker to express what they mean. That goes some way to explain why speakers can whistle to each other and still understand each other, because when they whistle, the tone is still preserved. But it doesn't go all the way to explaining that. Pirahã still does have its 10 or 11 phonemes we discussed, and they're clearly important in conveying information too. Doesn't it follow that if people just whistle to each other without using normal speech sounds, some of their meaning must get lost? Well, tones and phonemes aren't the only things that are important in Pirahã. Like in a lot of languages, syllables of words have different weights depending on how many consonants and vowels they contain. Heavier syllables take longer to pronounce than lighter syllables. An example of a heavy syllable would be one with a voiceless consonant and then 2 vowels. A lighter syllable might just have 1 voiced consonant and 1 vowel. So when they're whistling, Pirahã people can preserve the length or weight of a syllable to convey information about what kinds of phonemes would be in the syllable if they were speaking normally. So take the word ishir huai, which means liquid fuel. If you hummed that, a listener could recognise the tones and syllable weight. The letter C represents a voiceless consonant, the letter V represents a vowel, and the accent represents a high tone. This still leaves a few options for actual words it could be, but humans are very good at working information out from context. A 2005 study showed that people are able to predict what word comes next, even when they're in the middle of a fast conversation. So if a Pirahã person is unconsciously expecting a particular word, receiving the tone and syllable weight information will just confirm that they were right in their prediction. Or if they were wrong in their prediction, they'll have enough contextual information to construct what the word must have been. Let's say the sentence is, he went into the swamp and got eaten by a and you know that the next word must be either crocodile, egg, or leaf. It's obvious which one is the most likely. And in the rare event that the listener needs clarification, presumably they can just ask the speaker to actually say the word, although I have no experience with Pirahã, so I don't know whether that actually happens in practice. I chose our example word, ishir huai, deliberately. A 2014 paper by Gareth O'Neill explores how this whistle speech works in Pirahã, and he gives ishir huai as an example of a word where speakers, especially male speakers, will just swap around phonemes at random. This word can be pronounced ishir huai, kishir huai, pishir huai, bihir huai, or gihir huai, apparently with no clear pattern other than that ishir huai is the more common one. To go into more detail, O'Neill says that the sounds ba, da, ga, a are interchangeable with each other in certain positions in a word, and the way they're interchanged depends on the speaker. He points out that words do still have a clear, solid phonemic structure. Speakers will use one pronunciation of a word more commonly than any other. But because they rely so much on tone and syllable weight, they don't really need to be that strict about saying the right phonemes. After all, ba, da, ga and a are all voiceless consonants, so there's no difference in syllable weight between ba, da, ga and a. So if a speaker was whistling speech, the listener wouldn't be able to tell those four consonants apart anyway. So that's about as much as I have to say about Pirahã phonology. If you're interested in the controversy around certain aspects of its grammar, I did a video a while ago where I went through some of that, but the long story short is that a linguist called Dan Everett has studied the language more than anyone else, and has made a claim about its grammar that a lot of people are sceptical of, and that is that speakers don't use recursive sentences. So where an English speaker might word a sentence like, the dog bit the man that walked down the path, a Pirahã speaker might break that down into two sentences. Everett based this on observations he made while he was living with the Pirahã, and on the way they would correct his speech if he tried to use recursive sentences. And that's important because it shows the Pirahãs can understand recursive sentences and they can think recursively, it's just that the recursion might not be reflected in their language. There are a number of reasons why that's controversial. For one thing, recursion is one of the very few features of grammar that seems to be universal or nearly universal across all languages. So it's quite a big thing to say you've found a language without it. And that doesn't necessarily make it false, but people have pointed out that Everett is one of very few people who speaks the Pirahã language and isn't ethnically Pirahã himself, so it boils down to one person making what sounds like a very big claim. I've simplified the controversy a bit here, but there's that's a sort of too long didn't read version of it. But whatever your opinion of Dan Everett's research on Pirahã syntax, remember that it is an actual spoken language. Its speakers are just normal people going about their lives, and they are not the same thing as the controversy that surrounds them. I'm going to address one more thing that I anticipate might appear in the comments because it has before, and that's my pronunciation of the word Pirahã. The word isn't a Pirahã word. My best guess is that it's Portuguese and it's natively pronounced something like Pirahã. When we pronounce foreign words, we often convert the foreign words into the phonemes that we're used to using in our native language. That's why I say amigo instead of amigo. So the way you convert the word Pirahã to English phonemes will depend on your dialect. The two big points of disagreement seem to be on whether it should end in R or AN, and whether the alveolar tap, ra, should be interpreted as the English D phoneme or the English R phoneme. The original word has a nasal vowel, And English doesn't have nasal vowels, so it's up to you whether you convert that into arn or just r. How you interpret the alveolar tap, era, will depend on your dialect. If you speak American or Australian English, this exact sound, the alveolar tap, is probably how you pronounce the d phoneme when it appears between vowels. So seeing as it's between two vowels in this foreign word, it makes sense for you to interpret that as your d phoneme. I don't usually use an alveolar tap for my d phoneme, and older members of my family, like my grandfather, use the alveolar tap, ra, as an allophone of the r phoneme. So from my perspective, it's intuitive to use my r phoneme to interpret the tap. So that's why I say Pirahã, but some people may say Pirahã or Pirahã. Either way, that's not the word they use for themselves, so it doesn't really matter too much. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I would encourage you to read more about this if you're interested. I've put some links in the description, and I'll talk to you next time.
Ai này hoặc là hay chơi ai vậy ai vậy hoặc là hay ít ai hoặc là hay ít ai vậy này hoặc là hay ai này ai số ai chơi ai vậy hay tụp cái ai rồi chơi